It's really wonderful to see such huge interest in the topic of today. As you all know, today marks 5 years since Rana Plaza and the collapse of a garment factory there, which killed more than 1,000 workers and really put a spotlight on the vulnerable situation that many of workers in the global textile industry work under. Ludwig was supposed to inform you, but forgot that unfortunately one of our panelists had to cancel on a very late notice, Raoul Sharma. So I'm very sorry to disappoint you about that, but we will try to make up for it. We have a really knowledgeable panel with us, representing a wide range of perspectives. Both from the fashion industry and from civil society organizations working to advance corporate responsibility in the industry. We have panelists from China joining us over Zoom from Beijing. I don't know why he hasn't turned on his camera yet, but he will join us. Yeah, there he is. Very good. So I'll start by introducing a very old colleague of mine, actually, and of a partner of the Raoul Wallenberg Institute, Professor Liang Xiaohui, who teaches business and human rights at Peking University, and who has worked in the Chinese textile industry to develop standards, both in terms of social issues and environmental issues for many, many years. So a lot of experience there. And Liang Xiaohui is also a lawyer. And then on our panelist, we also have economists. Jens Hultman, who's an associate professor at the Department of Business Administration, whose research focuses on global supply chains. And you've done a lot of research and work with Swedish companies. And then we have Jonah, who works at H&M since a number of years back.
2008.
2008. You've worked a lot in China and also for H&M in Cambodia. So we will have a lot of questions around how H&M works to improve working conditions in your supply chains across Asia. And then we have Songul, who has worked at H&M and IKEA, but now you lead IM's work with fair trade.
Yes.
So you will bring both the perspective from the fashion industry and from an NGO that works with these
slow fashion.
Slow fashion,
yeah.
Fast fashion and slow fashion.
Yes.
So very much looking forward to this. And then, of course, we have an extremely knowledgeable and engaged audience. So with one panelist missing, that will leave us more time for discussion and questions, which is great. So maybe I can, just to know who's here, how many of you are students at Lund University? The great majority, the vast majority. How many are researchers, teachers? Yeah. And then how many of you work in business? Quite a number as well. And how many work in different civil society organizations working on these issues? 1 or 2, 3. Yeah. Very good. A warm welcome. So let's start with asking, it's been 5 years since Rana Plaza, but I mean, these issues have been in the spotlight for at least 2 decades. It started when media and consumers noticed the horrendous sweatshop conditions that were prevalent in Asia, across Asia, in China and other places, as long as 20 years ago. So much, how much has really changed? How much progress has been made over these 2 decades? And has working conditions improved at all? This is the first question I would like to ask, perhaps both of you, Jens, and of Xiaohui. But perhaps with the privilege of being the only person not in the room, maybe you can start, Xiaohui, and tell us a bit about the major trends, developments you've seen in China and globally.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? Cool. So, first, I'm very sorry not to be there and to join you. And secondly, I'm very proud to be on this panel. As my old friend Malin already said, yes, I've been working in this industry for almost 15 years. Meanwhile, I'm also teaching business and human rights in university, and actually now I teach this course in several universities, including two business schools. So I think, yeah. First, let's start with some, a looking back for the past 2 decades in this industry. I think one thing I would like to highlight is that definitely the fashion or textile or garment industry was or has been the first industry all across the globe that has been, in a way, focused by international players, brands, and also NGOs in terms of CSR and sustainable development. And in a way, this has pushed the business in this industry to pioneer in many things, including the first code of conduct for suppliers was actually produced by a fashion brand. And also many CSR initiatives, including reporting, including, I would say, even financial environmental accounting in China, for instance, actually started from Chinese, from the textile industry. So I think the industry is pioneering in terms of CSR and sustainability in the past 2 decades. That's definitely true. And one of the reasons for this is because this industry is very much globalized and very much privatized. And also, this is an industry that is so close to consumers, to everybody in the world. So I think the nature of this industry has made itself a very natural focus of CSR in the past 2 decades. But also, on the other hand, because this is a low-end industry in terms of investment, and also there is a very broad market for this industry. So the industry is growing very fast in the past two decades in all over the world, especially, I mean, if we look at it, the suppliers in Asia and the brands in Europe and the States, you will see that the business from all sectors, from all the sections of the value chain has grown very fast in the past 2 decades. And this has also brought a lot of, impacts on many people, including workers in the suppliers' workshops, and also consumers as well. So I think this is an industry that has a very big impacts around the globe, and also has a very broad presence around the globe. So I think for the industry, it has been a very big pressure for in the past 2 decades from civil society and also from the government to improve the working conditions, to improve their environmental, for instance, performances. So this has also made a lot of focuses and also a lot of resources going into this industry. So from the World Bank, from the brands, from the national governments, and also from civil society, and from suppliers. But really, we should really look at how we have, how much we have achieved in these two decades. I would like to make two very important points. One is compared with other sectors. I'm saying sectors like mining, like ICT, like automobile, like construction, infrastructure. I think the CSR work in this industry, globally, it's very much structured, and also it's very much inclusive. As I already mentioned, from government, from business society, from civil society, everybody is in there, is already doing something, and also everybody is collaborating with others. So this is a very good progress in the past two decades. So let me put it simply: everybody is working towards a common end, which is to make this industry more responsible and sustainable. And secondly, I think it's also very clear that we have seen the many innovative initiatives from all sections of the supply chain or the value chain. So everybody is trying their very best to contribute to this force, from brands, from suppliers, from consumers. So, for instance, recently in China, I think HM is playing a very important role in this. Brands and also civil society organizations, and also the community of the neighborhoods, they're collaborating to reuse or to recycle the fabrics and also use the used garments. So I think this is very, very important, because people are trying to find their own ways, and also, meanwhile, to collaborate with others to solve the issues. And then I think if we look at the positive ways, positive in progress, these are most important two things. But still, I think challenges are very clear. For instance, if we look at this reuse or recycle of garments, there are very clear barriers or obstacles for this to achieve. For instance, one of the very important, interesting points raised by some lawyers in China is when you collect a reused or used garment and give this to somebody else, you have to actually to show that you have the ownership of this piece of garment, which is very important, because we also have to do this in a way of rule of law. So also, there's also a challenge for the technology. Even if we still use this case of recycling fabrics or garments, it's very difficult to recycle different fabrics altogether. But clearly they are mixed when we collect them from neighborhood. So certainly we still need investment, because if you buy, our colleagues from HM would make this even more clear. If you buy a new piece of clothes, it costs less. If then you buy something that is recycled. So there are really, really different challenges for us, or for the whole global textile stakeholders to tackle, to solve. And most of them are very big issues, from financial aspect, from technology aspect, also from legal aspect. So I think I would stop here and give some time to my colleagues.
Thank you.
And later I would like to say something about China, because China definitely is the biggest player in the textile industry around the globe. So just give you two figures. One is China produces world's 43% of garments still. And we also process almost 65% of fibers around the globe. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Xiaohui. I mean, that was quite an optimistic picture you painted of the big developments in the textile industry, both the important role the textile industry has played in pioneering and developing innovative methods and collaborations to improve. But you didn't say much about whether actual work, has this made a difference to the workers themselves? So one, maybe I can ask that question of you, Jens. I mean, this Xiaohui mentioned, we now work with code of conducts, we work with audits, but those have proved to be very, very insufficient. You can't fatten a pig by weighing it, is how one would say. You can't improve conditions in factories by checking the conditions once per year. So there's a really big need for capacity building across the industry. And also, I mean, another systemic issue is that once you improve working conditions in one place, like China, buyers move elsewhere. So from China to Bangladesh to Ethiopia. How do you see the big picture?
Let me start by addressing your initial question. What has happened over the past 2 decades? I started off doing research in this area in a little bit more than 10 years ago, and I mean, this is a huge issue, and I look at things from a corporate point of view. So in my research, I'm originally in purchasing and industrial marketing, and I mean this is a huge challenge for the retail sector. If we look at the typical retail firm, they have around they have a couple of hundred suppliers. Often these suppliers are in the developing world. For the primary reason for that is that it's they're buying to a low cost in developing countries. The suppliers then have sub-suppliers, so it's an incredibly complex system. If we take a very simple
take a T-shirt in an H&M shop here. What's the supply chain?
From a consumer point of view or from a layman point of view, it's a very simple product. It's a T-shirt. But from a supply side point of view, it's a complex product. Fashion items are often complex products with a number of suppliers, first tier, second tier, and this of course presents a huge challenge for a retail company, because retailers have their competence is not in production. So we as consumers, we buy from a retail company here in Sweden, H&M or whatever company, and these companies they then have so they're good in distribution rather than production. So the typical retail firm does not produce, but buy from external sources. And
so they don't have factories that
they don't have factories themselves, no. Which of course exposes them to enormous challenges and risks, because they are then sourcing out activities to other companies. So the challenge for a lot of or for the retailers, the challenge is then in the purchasing side of the organization, so the upstream side of the organization for H&M or for MQ or whatever company it is. They need to govern so that others follow the code of conduct that H&M is or the retailer then have set up. If we look at the last 2 decades, I mean, a lot of things have happened. I think one, and I'll come to the question whether this has affected people working in the sector. But looking at this from a business point of view, I mean, the fact that we can see an increasing flora of code of conducts, we can see that there are governance systems in place in a completely different way than 20 years ago. We can see companies building up competences around this, and we can also see local presence, because I think that is key. It's very difficult to govern and control a supply chain if you are not locally present. I think that was the case for a lot of Swedish companies, not only in the fashion sector but also in other sectors. It was a typical situation that you had a purchasing function but not a purchasing office in the developing world.
And that's still the case for a lot of small and medium-sized companies.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Another thing that I think have changed over time is that there is not only change in the buying side of the supply chain, but also in the supply side. From my experience, when visiting in my research, when I visited suppliers, I think that you can see that suppliers, they are also retailers or the buying side, they are organizing themselves to become better, to put attention and to put these issues in the spotlight. But suppliers, they are also starting to organize themselves. So there is a clear counterpart also, which I think is even though there is, of course, I'm not saying that everything is okay or that everything is working fine, but there has happened a lot of things in this sector. So I'm also fairly optimistic.
And if you mention one main obstacle, what would that be? Is that possible, or is it too complex? Is it too? I mean, I'll give you a hint.
We can come back to that later, but I think the main challenge is that in the fast fashion business model, there are, I mean, structural or fairly complex balancing acts that needs to be dealt with, and there is no silver bullet on how to solve that problem. But maybe we can come back to that later.
Yes. Let's invite Jonah to the discussion. You're a social sustainability expert at H&M. You've worked with this. You now work in Stockholm, but you work a lot in the various countries where H&M supplies from. So excuse me, I have a really bad cough. In your latest sustainability report, which came out just the other week, you mentioned two areas that are sort of the main themes. And I would like you to focus a little bit on one of them, which is that H&M has committed to improving I don't know what your exact formulation is, but you can tell, but to improve working conditions through providing fair jobs, or what is your, so, I mean, I get a sense as a consumer and also as someone who's working in this area that there is a lot of frustration. Yes, a lot has happened in terms of codes of conduct and reporting. Companies make really, really good reports nowadays, some companies, sustainability reports, but you're still left with the question, what actually does this translate into? Concrete practices, concrete improvements. So H&M has committed to fair jobs, to providing fair jobs, but how has that translated into practice? What concretely have you done to ensure this?
Yes, absolutely, and thank you, and I'm happy to be here. I mean, there's a lot to be said about that. I'll try to use the 5 minutes that Malin has so strictly given us to give you a snapshot and prepare the ground for hopefully a good discussion with questions from you guys later on. First of all, just to echo what has been said by Xiaohui and Jens, I mean, of course, it's something we recognize ourselves, and to set the ground, I'm sure you all know H&M, but we're a company of 170,000 employees. We source from around 2,000 independent factories around the world, still mainly in Asia, but also in Europe and Africa to a degree. We have, I mean, Malin, you mentioned, and I'm building up to come to the really interesting initiatives going on within the fair and equal part of our strategy, which contains the Fair Jobs program. Malin, you mentioned you can't fatten a pig by weighing it, and it certainly is true. I mean, it's been true and it's been known and consensus around the fact in the textile industry for a long time that you can't bring about positive change by auditing factories 5 days a week. I know this myself from first hand. I started as a factory auditor in China, and you'd see this, what we call yo-yo findings. You'd come there one day and ask someone to unlock an emergency exit. You come there on Friday and it was locked again, and so on. So, and out of that, a lot of change has happened development, I think, in the last 10 years. Still assessments needed because we need to, brands like H&M need to report. I'm sure we'll touch upon transparency, and there's a lot of interest from different stakeholders in knowing what is the situation in global supply chain. And there's a business interest from brands to know what is the situation. So there's a certain hygiene factor you need to assess. Are the factories safe? Are legal wages paid? Are wastewater treated, and so on? And also, I'll not talk about that so much, but in that area, there's also interesting developments going on. For example, in the fashion industry, more and more brands are gathering around common standards, common methods of assessments. There's now one really interesting initiative that has around 40% of the fashion industry behind it, which will, at the end of the day, hopefully make it possible for you to compare which products are more. Is an H&M T-shirt more sustainable? Is it more? Is it produced under more fairer working conditions than a T-shirts from brand X, Y, or Z, for example? So that's interesting. But I think where H&M has landed, and this is really our fair and equal strategy, like you said, you can read more about this in our sustainability report, which was launched last week. But in a snapshot, it's really centered around what we call fair jobs. And a cornerstone of fair jobs is what we call a fair living wage. And of course, a living wage and the human right to earn a living wage. So a wage that you can provide for yourself and your family, which also allows for some discretionary income to go into savings and so on, is perhaps, when you talk about social sustainability or CSR, of course, one of the more important questions and social challenges we face today. Our strategy around that is that wages need to go up. There are far too many people in global supply chains, including our own, not earning a living wage. Then, and this, I think, Xiaohui, you mentioned as well. There's a lot of gathering around common goals. There's a lot of agreement on what is the end goal, but then there's of course some debate on how to bring that about. And I am myself in dialogue quite often with representatives from civil society, for example, saying that H&M needs to pay a higher wage, for example. Now, we feel that is problematic for various reasons. One is that we have built our fair and equal strategy around the assumption that the most sustainable way to bring about not only living wages, but basically any improvement in social working conditions is if you empower the people in the supply chains to drive these questions themselves. So our strategy is very much built around improving industrial relations, improving the capabilities of our suppliers and the representatives of workers and trade unions to enter into negotiations around collective bargaining agreements, for example. Now we're doing that, so that's the vision, empowerment of the parties on the labor market to drive improvements. The how then, of course, there's also a lot of initiatives going on there. You mentioned capacity building. We are, and so are some other brands, driving projects, capacity building projects. We are doing it together with the International Labour Organization on building the capacity, so trainings for trade unions and our suppliers on how to negotiate, how to communicate, knowledge of legal rights and obligations. We also have what is called a global framework agreement, which is somewhat of a trend at the moment, where we as a brand have entered into an agreement with an international trade union. In our case, it's Industry All Global Union based in Geneva, where we both agree on them on their part on strengthening the capacity of local trade unions in our production markets. So strengthen their organizational capabilities, their knowledge of laws, their skills at negotiating and so on. We on our end agree within this agreement, we undertake or commit to making sure that our suppliers respect freedom of association and respect relevant laws. And that they also have sort of equivalent skills on negotiating and entering into collective bargaining agreements. Another initiative, and I sense my time is running out, but another interesting initiative that we feel very hopeful about is a group called ACT, which is an acronym for Action, Collaboration, Transformation. The ACT is a group, it's a formal group set up with the headquarters in Berlin, which is a group of, I think now it's 18 European brands, so it's H&M and 17 more, including Primark and a number of others, together again with Industry All Global Union. And the goal of ACT is to bring about living wages. And the means which we have set out to do that is through industry-wide collective bargaining. And what we mean by industry-wide collective bargaining is not factory per factory. We source from 2,000 factories around the world. Some in some countries where it's a bit more problematic to work with trade unions than others. But what we want to see is kind of as we have it in Sweden. And the whole notion is in fact to some degree inspired by the Swedish model, that we want on an industry level. So we want in Cambodia, we would like to see one collective bargaining agreement governing wages and other working conditions. In Bangladesh, another one, and so on. And then again, Malin, you mentioned also the challenge around the fact that conditions improve in one market and the industry kind of slides. And it's not only brands. I mean, we sometimes lose suppliers in some markets because they pack up their factories and invest in other countries. Because they are making exactly, I mean, our suppliers are businessmen and women, and they make decisions based on a profitability analysis. So you do need to address this on an international level as well. So ACT is, in fact, at the moment conducting country consultations with governments, industry associations, and trade unions in several countries at the same time. So the idea is to roll this out in several countries to create a level playing field, so to speak. I'll stop there. There's much more to say, but
no, we'll get back to a lot of these very interesting aspects of how fast fashion or unsustainable fashion can become more sustainable, or slow fashion, you called it. And this was from H&M's perspective, what they as a company can do to bring about change within the industry with partners. Could you tell us a bit about how what your fair trade model consists of, and how you see, how does change happen?
Doing a revolution. We can
paradigm shift, a revolution.
I Am Fair Trade is based on the idea that we work with the idea that to change the consumers' behaviors and the way that they are buying, the lifestyle change, and we do that through the storytelling. So we try to empower the small-scale organizations that are out in different countries that are not so rich. So by empowering them, by telling the stories about them, and with the products we have the storytelling. We use the storytelling way to lift the person behind the product and to empower them. And the goal is not only to give them the fair wage or giving them the right price for the products. It's also a way to take to help them out of the it's like sorry, it's my first pathway out of the poverty. So to strengthen and empowering the person behind the product. So that's more what we are working with. That's the idea and that's the goal. So it's not selling the product. It's also with the slow fashion, as I told you, we need to go back to the slow fashion that is a movement against fast fashion. And that is to take care of the handcraft, the environment, the people behind it. So it's the whole eco chain with the slow fashion. And I see that it's coming more, but there is more to do. There is a lot more to do there. And it's tough to fight against the fast fashion also. And to reach out to the consumer. But through the storytelling, that's what we are doing, and that's to empowering the small-scale producers and organizations.
Thank you. One thing that has been really key has been around making companies more transparent about their practices, because the only way you, as a consumer, can put pressure on companies is if you have an idea about where is my T-shirt produced, under what conditions. So there's been a whole movement around making companies more transparent. And just yesterday, the Fashion Industry Transparency Index came out with their report, their annual report, and it had some good news in it. I mean, relatively good news. Most companies still really lack in terms of transparency, but One company that had moved up a little bit in the index was H&M, which now scored over 50% in terms of the transparency requirements. But could we discuss a little bit of transparency? Maybe Xiaohui, could you start by telling us what does it mean in practice for a company to be transparent about their supply chains? Obviously, producing a nice report, a sustainability report, where you talk about your policy is not sufficient to turn transparency into accountability. So what does true transparency look like in practice? And also, I wanted you to say a little bit about developments in China. China has, over these 2 decades that we've been discussing, China's moved from being merely the factory of the whole world to being a really economic superpower. So China now has investments and companies and impact across the world. And Xiaohui, you work with a number of these companies to promote their responsibility and sustainability as they produce now in Cambodia and other Southeast Asian countries. So Xiaohui, any of those very big questions that you want to address, please go ahead.
Thank you, Malin. First about this transparency, yes, I think that's very crucial for the whole industry to be more responsible, because if you cannot see, the chain, you will not know them, and you cannot monitor or evaluate them. So transparency is the key. But how can we do that? I think actually I would like to use one very interesting case, that is the company of Apple, which I think is actually, in a way, leading the way of transparency. So first, I think we need to...
I'll just say, Apple isn't a company we normally associate with very responsible business practices. In particular in China, there's been a lot of stories coming out about suicides in Apple suppliers, and so it's interesting that you use them as an example of good practice. But please go ahead.
Okay, that's a very good note. I think this compared with other companies, they are doing quite a lot. I'm not saying that these things are really, making everything correct or making everything right, but this is the right way to go. First, I think they need to let us know, let the consumers know all their suppliers. So we need to know their whole chain. If we are a government industry, if you have a fashion company, I think we need to know who produced their garments, who dyed their fabrics, and who actually wove their fabrics, and who plant the cotton, or raise the sheep, or produce the chemical fiber. So I think the first thing we need to know is the whole players or the whole suppliers along the products chain. So if you check the website of Apple, actually they disclosed almost all their suppliers around the globe. So they have a suppliers map. So you click, for instance, China, you will know how many suppliers are actually from China, and from which country, which region, from which province, and you can click into that province. You can find very specific information about factories in there. I think this is the first thing we need to know. We need to be transparent. And secondly, we need to know how they actually work with their suppliers. I think several people just mentioned the audit. Yes, we need to know the results of the audits, but we also want to know how they actually collaborate with their suppliers, how they can empower their suppliers, and how they can bring capacity to their suppliers. So I think most companies can in their sustainability or CSR report will highlight they provide training to suppliers. They also provide technical support to suppliers. But in most cases, I find this information are very general. So if we know what kind of capacity they are providing to the suppliers, what kind of training, I think this kind of information we need to know more. And also how this training, this capacity building actually bring real changes. So they also need to follow the effect of their capacity building programs. And thirdly, I think it's also very important by transparency along supply chain. I think we also need to know the whole line of materials of the products. It's not just fabrics. It's about the accessories. It's about where the products are dyed. So this kind of information we also need to know. So by transparency, I think the companies need to do a lot of things, very holistic things, many things to do together. So far, I don't think many brands or many businesses can actually do that.
No, I mean in this transparency index, very few score. Most companies score only 20%.
That's right.
And very few, I think 10 companies or so, score above 50. So transparency, there's certainly a lot of room for improvement.
Yes. Thank you. And let me switch a little bit to China. As I said, China is very important in this industry. And China in the past 2 decades also developed quite a lot, especially in the exports. For instance, the textile industry is now also one of the spotlights of this China and US trade war. That's very interesting. It also says how important this industry is for China and also for the States, and also actually for the world. And we are focusing today mainly on business and human rights and the industry's impact on, for instance, labor rights. I think China has gone a very interesting way in the past two decades. For instance, 10 years ago, when I was when I visited the factories in Southeast China, it's very easy for me to find very discriminative, posters for recruitment. For instance, people there were posters saying we only need people from 2 provinces. We only need female workers. We only need people between the age of 20 to 25. So it's like that. So you can see the systematic discrimination against workers, in China in the past, I would say 10 years ago. But the structural change of labor market in the past decade totally changed this picture. We were enjoying labor suppliers 10 years ago, but now we are actually suffering from labor shortage in China. So this has brought substantial changes and impacts on labor rights in the industry, especially for garment industry, which use a lot of workers. So even today, the Chinese textile and garment industry will hire about 22 million workers, direct employment. And indirectly, I think the industry has an impact on the livelihood of over 100 million people in China. So the industry has a very profound impact on people, especially through the line of work or employment. So 10 years ago, the challenges we faced were discrimination, were very low wages, very shabby working conditions in Chinese factories. I think the labor structure or the labor market structure has changed this thing a lot. Today, I think very few companies, very few factories would discriminate their workers on the grounds of age or gender, or even origin of provinces. I was in a factory last year in Fujian province, and they have also the posters for recruitment. It only says how much you can earn in our factory in a month, and the only condition for the workers to get involved, to get recruited, is simple as that. Whoever can do the work. So it's simple as that.
So Xiaohui, I mean, there's been. I have to cut you short now because I have to hand over the word to the other panelists. But so if I can sum up what you've said, because of global economic shifts and domestic shifts in the economy, and and also due to consumer pressure, and also due to industry initiatives, working conditions to some extent have improved in China. But then there's a couple of questions that I would like us to perhaps use the remaining time for our discussion before we move over to questions. One is, as labor conditions improve in one country, for example, wages, doesn't the problem just move elsewhere? Isn't that how it works? I would like to ask you that. And how can we prevent that from happening? And then the other issue is something that you touched upon, Jonah, and which is extremely difficult to work on in China: collective bargaining, trade unions, freedom of association. How do you empower bottom up? I mean, we can't just rely on companies to improve conditions. We have to rely on consumer pressure. We have to rely on the workers negotiating their own conditions. That's the only way to get sustainable change. So how do you do that in a country like China? But there are many others, but China doesn't allow freedom of association, doesn't allow forming of free and independent trade unions. So how do you approach that as H&M in China?
Let me start by revolting a little bit and coming back to this transparency issue, because I think a few of us had a comment on that. I think it's good. Brands are held responsible for the account of their suppliers, and that is a good thing. It's also part of the nature of specialization, that if you outsource to someone else, it's still your responsibility to make sure that the products are manufactured in a responsible way, I think. When it comes to sustainability, I think we as consumers, we know very little about the supply side. Suppliers are often, I mean, we know about the country of origin, we might know a few things about the material and about the production, but the factories and the suppliers, and in particular the factory workers, they are completely faceless to us. We don't know anything about that. So I think that transparency is important and could definitely be improved. In my research, I've used transparency as a marker of maturity. So the more mature companies are, the more open they are also to transparency. And I think that is an important note to make. One example of such transparency would be, for example, that you would, rather than having this hunter-prey relationship with NGOs, for example, you would have a more collaborative approach. That is an example of transparency in the sector, which I think is very constructive and very positive.
Hunter-prey, you mean like
hunter-prey? I mean that cat and mouse, a cat and mouse relationship, right? Yeah. So that and that is not a constructive way of working from neither side. Another example or a manifestation of transparency is that you report progress, and that you, for example, report non-compliance management. So how many situations of child labor did we have in our supply chain, or how many instances of whatever CSR breach did we have, and how did we manage it? So take it to a next step. Not only report, but also report progress. How do we try to avoid these situations in the long run? And that is another marker of maturity in the industry that I think that There is, of course, a huge variation in the approach of CSR work, depending on the sector you are in, depending on the size of the firm, and depending on what area you work in, what materials you buy, or what region you buy from, and so on. It's a huge difference. But from on a general note, transparency is a marker of maturity in my world. Now, coming back to the question about moving production, I think it's a
moving the problem around.
Yeah, moving. That is in a market economy where companies decide to buy from the lowest bidder, so to speak. That is a natural development. Unfortunate in many ways, but that is part of the game.
Yes, but so how do we address that? How do we raise the level playing field? How do we create this common standards then that are global? Is it through trade unions?
Yeah, through collaboration.
Yeah.
And communication.
Through collaboration and communication. Okay. How does that? What do you think, Jonah? I mean, both on the specific question of how do you work on these issues in countries where it's not allowed. You're not allowed to establish a trade union. So how do you empower workers then in that context? And how do you, as a company, avoid the race to the bottom and moving the problem around from country to country?
I'll do a similar sort of volt as like Jens did and go back to transparency, because I think, I mean, there's a lot of talk about transparency. I mean, it's certainly a buzzword, and I think you need to go back and ask transparency for what sake and for what usage and to what purpose. And for us, and I think for many others, transparency is really a key to driving change. It's an instrument in achieving positive change, and a lot of that has to do, of course, with accountability. We feel fairly secure. You talked about maturity. We feel that we can answer the questions. We can reveal information about ourselves and our supply chain. But we think, we believe, as a global fashion company, that it would actually benefit us if consumers were empowered to ask more informed questions about the brands they buy their fashion from, how they manage their supply chains, and so on. I mean, you talk about human rights management, you talk about know and show. The concept of asking a company, what do you know about your supply chain, and can you show that you know it? Now, we feel secure enough in how we work. I mean, there's lots of improvement to be done, and there's lots of work ahead, but we feel that in comparison with some of our peers, I mean, we're already somewhere along, 55% when it comes to transparency according to Fashion Revolution. There's also the case to be made. I mean, Xiaohui talked about knowing your supply chain, and I think many of us would be shocked if you get an insight into how many brands actually do not know where the products that they are selling are actually coming from. We make a distinction between traceability and transparency. So within the industry, kind of traceability sometimes is taken to mean where does your products, your fabrics, your fibers come from. Transparency is how you communicate with stakeholders, governments, consumers about it. But it's kind of, you can also call it all transparency. And I think asking brands, I mean, how much traceability backwards? I mean, how far upstream do they have? I think that is also a way of driving. If you talk about freedom of association, to bridge over to that, I mean, asking questions about how do brands know that workers are allowed to form trade unions in say, Cambodia or Bangladesh, or if not, I mean, how do they work with that in China? If you can't answer, there's probably room for improvement in that aspect. Now, working with freedom of association and empowering trade unions is challenging also in the production markets we source from, where it's actually allowed. I mean, quite often it is very immature trade unions. Quite often our suppliers, often it's Chinese suppliers who moved with us to Cambodia, for example, or other countries, and often they come from a background where the experiences of working with trade unions is quite limited. I mean, if you're a Chinese supplier from Jiangsu province, you probably have never encountered a real trade union until you set up a factory in Cambodia or Myanmar. So there's going to be there's learnings to be made on both sides of the fence, so to speak. And we see very much our role as facilitating that. So entering into partnerships with ILO, provide trainings, capacity building, agreements with with global unions, because also, of course, if our suppliers who have very limited knowledge in how to manage a negotiation or an industrial conflict, if they come across a trade union that's extremely militant and really maybe not have a particularly constructive mindset, that's gonna color their approach going ahead as well. So we need to work with global trade unions so they can impart sort of trade union best practice also on the local affiliates, which are especially in Myanmar. I could talk hours about. I mean, there's lots of people in Myanmar who want to contribute to the country, but there's also people who were just let out of prison essentially and set up the trade union they tried to form back in 1988. So I mean, there's also, there's lots of things to learn on both ends. Now, particularly for China, we have not yet tried to work with trade unions. I mean, we have a dialogue with the All China Confederation of Trade Unions, of course. But when it comes to actually driving collective bargaining agreements and so on in China, you have to work. We talk sometimes about parallel means. We cannot go the usual routes of freedom of association and work with several trade unions and so on. We still have an ambition to sort of make the same results come about. So we have worked with other not the International Labour Organization, for example. We have worked with private service providers in China who have been trained. We actually flew a bunch of them to Stockholm and had IF Metal train them in sort of agreed upon principles on freedom of association and trade union work. So they went back and helped us facilitate elections of worker representatives in our. Now we're up to about 200 factories in China where we've held more or less free elections for worker representatives who are then gone on to negotiate various types of agreements with factory management. So it's kind of, there will be restrictions, absolutely. But you need to look at what's possible within those restrictions. What parallel means are there to work with? Because there's always something you can do.
Yeah, thank you. Songul, maybe wrapping up this part of the panel before we turn to questions and reflections from the audience. One thing that we've touched upon is this issue around a living wage and what salaries do we pay. And Jonah was saying, if I interpret you correctly, that H&M doesn't believe in a model where H&M simply increases salaries. They believe in building the power of trade unions to negotiate. And you can get into why that is, but what do you think about that model? What is IM's position on this?
I was noting that because that's one model. But I also think that as a company, you have a big responsibility to put a demand on the factory owners. And also we have to look at what went wrong with the values and the business, and where is the balance when we started this slow fashion, in this fast fashion, the consumption, and who is responsible in the end. And we have discussed a lot of problems and complex and what have been done, but it's not enough as I can see it. And I think that we need to change our whole lifestyle, how we look at things, how we consume, how we measure the values. So I think it's more like we have to, it's the whole philosophy of consumption and consuming and production. It's a global change. We need a really global change. And
nothing less than a paradigm shift, it sounds like.
Yes, yeah. And I think we can keep it simple. Just say like, are the business owner, are they prepared to earn less? And are we as consumer willing to pay more? I think that is the main, we have to go back and look at that. Do I want to change my lifestyle? So I don't think it's so complex as we think it is, because what is revolution, as we have been talking about? It's us people, we have more power than we think. And why are we sitting here today? It's because of the pressure from the consumer. Otherwise, we will not be sitting here, maybe, and discussing this issue. So we all here has a bigger responsibility and more power than we think to do a change.
There is, of course, a shared responsibility, but I mean, with size comes responsibility as well. I mean, you are
If you're strong, you have to be kind. As
as Bamse said,
Yeah.
if you're strong, you have to be kind. I thought about it, but I thought we were speaking English, so maybe that wasn't a good reference. But I had that in mind as well.
One of my colleagues actually used to, when he did these types of panels, he used to carry around like a teddy bear of Bamse, and he would do that exactly. It's been known to. But it's, I mean, we accept that, of course.
And I mean, you have leverage. I mean, you could use your size to leverage in negotiations, I guess. Sorry.
But I also want to add, since I have always been 30 years in this business with the fast fashion, you have more power as a company. You have a really power to say that these are my demands, otherwise I will not work with you. But what happens with the profit then? So that balance, where the values and the profit, the balance between it, I think in the way, because we need the business, we need the industry, we need to create, empower people. So this we should not forget. But
and we will, one of the workshops this afternoon will focus specifically on the issue of whose responsibility, who is responsible. So we'll get into that. And it is very complex. I have to end by saying also it is that simple, but also not. But yeah, it's economically, and it's very complex, raising wages and the consequences then for the industry in Bangladesh, for example. And if we start consuming less, does that actually help local communities in Bangladesh or not? It's a big discussion. But now let's open up for reflections and questions. And those who want to make a reflection or a comment, please keep it very succinct and then get to your question. Yes? Well, hang on, we have a microphone. So.
Hello. My name is Linda, and I'm from In River PIM, and we work with product information. And as a consumer, I would like to have this transparency, perhaps, to see what's included in the product information when I make a decision to buy, because I rather pay more and buy less. And you can have the profit, because I have stock in H&M. But I mean, it hasn't been... It needs to be a change, and the consumer could see the transparency as well on the website when doing a purchase online, perhaps. Is that something you are planning to show, since you are good at the transparency?
I think
we'll take three and then get to answers. Yes, yeah.
I have one for IM about, because I was at a fair trade ambassador program, and I was really impressed with how they deal with accreditation, and I was just wondering if it's a similar system you work with, or how that works. Like, how do you ensure that everything you said? So yeah, thank you.
So question about the system of fair trade, how does it work? And we'll take one more.
Hello, my name is Tina. I come from Svalana, Indian, Bangladesh. I would like to hear some things about maybe contracts, but that's also something that I feel it's not only about living wages, but also the really insecure contracts that the workers have with the suppliers, and maybe most of all the sub-suppliers, where they're employing very, very short-term periods, days, weeks, etc.
Yep. Thank you. So let's start, or we had one more here, so we can take that, and then we'll do a round of answers.
Hi, my name is Adrienne, and this summer I will be opening a dye lab in Malmö, which is going to be dealing with natural dyes. And I'm a little bit sad that to only see one person who is really representing slow fashion. And perhaps my question is a little bit harsh, but at the end we got to it. And it is that a big company like H&M is going to take that leverage and make the step and turn the industry around. Because so far I'm not seeing this. And I know it's probably very hard because you're working towards profit. But I think the matter is much more urgent, and I think this change needs to happen much more sooner than we think, than we are planning it to come to a resolution of becoming a sustainable society, and to teach the consumers to be conscious.
Thank you. Let's start with Songul. The question of fair trade, does it work?
And how the auditions, because EM Fair Trade is the name of the business we have within the NGO, and the whole fair trade audition is something else. But we follow the fair trade principles, and we are also a member of WFTO, World Fair Trade Organization, where the conditions are tougher. So when you place an order at a small corporate, you prepay them, and during the production, if they need cash flow, you pay. And so we have this kind of control units. We support them as an NGO to become WFTO members also if they can't do it themselves. And but what we also do is, since we are an NGO and we work in a lot of countries, we also work with very small-scale organizations that doesn't have any audit. But our office at that area, they have control over it. And we feel that we should not leave anyone behind, because that is what is also a challenge within all these audits, within fair trade, WFTO, it's money, because it's a big setup to do an audit. It's not cheap. So we also work with very, very small scale. It's very transparent. We know them. We work with the organizations with other issues, maybe gender issues or equalities and education. But also we support them if they have an entrepreneur business. So that's, yeah.
What I really liked is that the message was really in like, it's not just we're like a corporation and we're just going to take like the cheapest labor. It's also about sharing knowledge and like seeing the videos of the people working, and like they're just so happy because they are empowered. Like what you're doing is you're empowering people, and that's like super amazing. So yeah, thank you for your work.
Thank you.
Jonah, 2 questions for H&M. I think one was around transparency and what kind of information you're willing to provide or planning to provide. And the other one was whether profit is the main obstacle to using your leverage to actually make change happen.
Right. I mean, the transparency question, there was one about precarious work or contracts. I can actually answer that quite quickly as well. Yeah.
Sorry.
The transparency, it's a good question, and the short answer is that consumer-facing transparency is coming. Maybe winter will come first, unfortunately, but it's been a lot of pilots. We've been involved in a number of pilots. We've even been involved with EU Commission pilots on consumer-facing transparencies or product, how you can see from your products where it's made and so on. So it's really on a lot of organizations, including ours, agenda. Now there's a lot of challenges around that, because there's quite a few different expectations on what that information should contain, and it's tricky to satisfy everybody and to get it into a model that works. But I believe it's coming, and it's coming quite soon. I mentioned this common tool that now around 40% of the fashion industry stands behind. It's an organization called Sustainable Apparel Coalition, and they have a measurement tool that actually measures the sustainability level at brands ourselves, at fabric or material, and at factory level.
Is that the Higgs
That's
index?
the Higg index. It's called HIGG, Higg index. It's not set in stone, but there's a very strong ambition within the SAC, which is a membership organization, which kind of complicates things. But there's certainly factions within the SAC, Sustainable Apparel Coalition, that wants to make this consumer-facing, so that you can go into different brands and different shops and see for each product what's the average or the combined score of brand, material, and factory. How sustainable is it, both on environment and social? So but it's coming. There's a few different initiatives like that. I would bet my money on.
You know, when you on the website you see other people who bought this also bought this one. You can have like, instead of buying this, you can buy this instead. It's a bit more expensive, but it will be better for the environment and for the social environment. Like you can weigh your products also within. That's just
it's one of the options on the table. I think that's exciting. The other side of that is also, of course, for designers at, for example, H&M or product developers, they will be able to do exactly the same thing. You will have a palette of materials and factors and so on, so you can compose according to how sustainable you want it to be. Hopefully, we will see that the more sustainable we make a product, the more attractive they will be to consumers. Because at the moment, that's quite disappointing. It's somewhat lacking. I mean, there's several surveys on how many people would be willing to pay more and so on. But I think this needs to go in tandem. So but consumer-facing transparency is definitely coming. I think our hope is that we'll be able to get behind a common standard. Otherwise, it's just going to be another jungle. When it comes to so that's about how much I can say about it, because I think that's where we are. Yeah. When it comes, so the organization is called Sustainable Apparel Coalition, or SAC. It's sac.org, I think. And their tool is called HIGG, H-I-G-G. Now, when it comes to precarious work or insecure working conditions, short-term contracts and so on, it's a very big problem. It's a global problem, and perhaps worth noting not only in the production markets for H&M and the fashion industry. Ask the barista for the major American coffee company who consistently works 37 hours just to avoid being entitled to sick leave and other social benefits. It's a big problem. In some of our production markets, it's a bigger problem than in some other markets. Specifically in Cambodia, we've been working quite a lot on it. And just to say that very straight, that it's nothing we accept. If you do a full-time job, if you are in essence an employee, you should have a fixed contract. You should have an open-ended contract. Of course, there needs to be flexibility for. Sometimes you need short-term work on projects, whatever, seasonal work and so on. But if you are a long-term worker, you should have a fixed contract. Just to give some of the, there's complexities here, and Cambodia is a good example where over about 10 years, they have developed a tradition, an interpretation of the Cambodian labor law and how they interpret severance pay. So the money you get when you're laid off, which is 5%, I think, of the total earnings. They have developed an interpretation, supported by some people in government, sadly, in Cambodia, whereby every time you leave a short-term contract, so a 3-month or 6-month work contract, you get 5% of your total earnings over that, say, 6-month period. And in a country like Cambodia, where living standards are quite low and wages are low and too low, of course, 5% bonus of everything you've earned over the past 6 months is a substantive amount of money to a Cambodian garment worker. So there's a very strong support for short-term, illegal short-term contracts from workers and then from trade unions, because trade unions in Cambodia compete for membership. So if workers perceive that the trade union doesn't stand up for their 6-monthly 5% bonus, they will go to another trade union. So we've been working quite actively with the trade unions in Cambodia for about 3 years to try to address this problem. But again, this is, both Xiaohui and you have mentioned collaborations, and this is one of those issues. It affects the entire industry, and it's deeply ingrained, and it's quite difficult for us to affect change alone, which doesn't mean that we accept it, and we're certainly trying, and we're seeing modest improvements. So it's, yes, I agree. It's a big problem, and it's a violation of fundamental rights. When it comes to affecting, I wasn't sure if I really understood your question. I'm going to apologize in advance, but I understand that your question was that when is H&M going to step up and actually drive fundamental change in the industry? Of course, there's 2 ways to look at that question. One is the quite harsh way of saying, well, we exist in the same paradigm as other fashion companies. I think, though, if you look, if you talk about what I work on, which is the social issues, wages, industrial relations, and so on, I see a number of initiatives and approaches that are very interesting, and I think are the beginning of a real change, sort of transcending the competition within the industry, and while still accepting that, of course, we're in the business to make a profit. One of them is, I mentioned this Action, Collaboration, Transformation. So this is a group of 18 European leading fashion retailers that are now jointly working and looking at what they call purchasing practices. So purchasing practices is how we buy from our suppliers. And we are looking at committing to certain countries. We're looking at isolating the labor cost to take that away from price negotiations with suppliers and so on. Now, so this is still early work, but you have 18 leading European fashion brands right now sitting in a room comparing how we source and how we negotiate prices and discussing the possibility of isolating labor costs to take that out of the competition and sort of start making action plans and how to transform our purchasing practices to enable living wages. So I think there are things going on, but I'm maybe not in a position here now to make any promises of a revolution, but it's I agree with you. I mean, you can also look at circularity and how we use resources. It's quite clear that the way we produce, sell, and consume fashion at the moment is not sustainable. It is not sustainable in its true sense. I mean, we can't keep on doing this where the World Overshoot Day keeps closer and closer to the wrong side of the year for every year. I mean, we need to change things, absolutely.
And I mean, one perhaps reflection at the end of that we could use a whole separate panel on is the global economic power shift that we've seen over the past 10 years, where H&M, yes, it's from a Swedish perspective, it's really powerful. It's a huge company, but I mean, the 10 biggest global companies, some of them, I think 2 or 3 of them are Chinese. So it is, yes, H&M has a lot of leverage, but if you look at a global scale, there's a number of companies that where there's very little consumer pressure, and also companies that aren't producing which are business to business. So yeah, it is tricky. Jens, you look like
I mean, the paradigm shift that we're talking about, it needs to come both from the supply side and from the demand side. I don't think they need to work they can't work in isolation. I mean, and H&M will at the end of the day, H&M will sell what is demanded, I guess. The sad thing here is that I mean, research shows that there is very little or no reward on the sell side in terms of CSR initiatives, which basically means that it's difficult for a retailer to promote to sell more.
There's no business case.
No, it's hard to find a business case for it. Although I mean, we talked about product information here, and I think that is. That is one way of empowering the customer, so that the customer can make informed choices. But I'm not sure that, or I'm quite sure that companies or customers still would pick the cheaper alternative, unfortunately. So there is a need for a change in attitude as well.
I mean, Sweden's flooded with very cheap products from China now, both through the e-commerce. Which is kind of surprising to me. I mean, how can we think that those are sustainably produced and delivered to Sweden? But they're very
That's
popular.
my point. I mean, we can talk about, and this session is more about the supply side of the fashion sector. But there is also, I mean, the change needs to come also from the demand side.
Yeah. Okay, so we have 5 minutes left, and I think there's room for 1 or maybe 2 questions if they're very, very to the core. And thank you for staying with us, Xiaohui.
Do you hear me? Yeah, good. My name is Philip. I study industrial management, and we've talked a lot about the Swedish view on things, but I'd like to get the Chinese perspective as well. So my question is directed to Xiaohui. And you were talking about how there's a lot less labor force now in China. This sounds like the perfect recipe to create unions, at least to us. But is that what the Chinese people want? Because it's as I understand, it's a very Western thing, and to just bring it to China, that's not the easiest solution, maybe. Do you see unions working in the future, or do you need more regulations from the government? What's your take on it?
Thank you. Good question. And 1 more there.
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Sorry. My question maybe is a little bit different. It's not about suppliers. My name is Veronica, and I'm teaching at the Department of Business Administration. I'm colleague to Jens. And I'm teaching the international business class, international business and multinational enterprises. So in my recent class, I have made a case of corporate hypocrisy. And basically, that was the case of H&M. And when I told them about the incidents which have become, broadly discussed in the fall, revealing that H&M is regularly transporting and burning completely new clothes in the factory in Denmark, specially designed for burning these new clothes, and tons of unused, completely new clothes which are completely safe, are burnt due to overproduction, which is of course the side effect of fast fashion. And when it comes to transparency, basically saying on the website that these clothes, some clothes are given to Red Cross, and then publicly denying this kind of situation. So my question is, has something changed?
Thank you. I think that's all we have time for, unfortunately. So, yeah, who wants to? Xiaohui, do you want to go first, please?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the question. Yes. I haven't finished earlier, but one thing I want to say is due to this shortage of labor, I think two things have happened. One is rising wages, but we also saw more incidents of child labor and student worker. So there's also a negative impact on labor rights of the shortage of labor. And when it comes to the freedom association, also trade union, yes, the shortage of labor also produces much more powerful, workforce, because they are in a selling side. So in the past decade, I've also saw the Chinese government and also our official trade unions have tried to within the system to give more power of more say to the workers. But clearly, I don't think that the trade union system like what we have in Cambodia or Myanmar is actually also not working because definitely it creates more chaos than order, I would say. So I think we need to, between this, we also need to keep some kind of balance. I don't think the Chinese trade union system is actually working, but on the other side, I think the function of trade union is actually to give to protect and guarantee the benefits of workers. So if we can also achieve that through better governance, that's also a choice. I hope I answered your question.
Thank you. Maybe just to explain that there is one trade union in China, which is supervised and governed by the Communist Party. So that's the trade union, the official trade union, and there's no option to establish independent and free trade unions. But one way to still work to promote better working conditions and giving voice to workers that has really been the case in China is through social media. I mean, every worker has a mobile phone and is able to inform him or herself, and then also better governance. So there are other ways, but I think still free and independent trade unions is sort of a key to a lot of the questions we've been discussing today. Who wants to address the
fact that
other question?
H&M allegedly burns clothes. I think
yes.
I can
I sense it was directed towards Jonah.
No, I mean I saw that we all saw the TV show as well as the Swedish spin-off in Uppdrag Granskning. I can only respectfully say that it's, in our view, it's very far from reality. I mean, the reality parts of it, absolutely, clothes were burned, but these were clothes, and our clothes are burned. And there's another problem here that we think should be talked about. No clothes that are safe to use and wear are burned. These are clothes that failed our tests if they were tests for chemicals or mold. And the problem, what happened with the Danish batch of clothes is that we measured different things. We measured them, they failed our test for mold. They were measured for other things in a different lab and came up with other results. we, in the name of transparency, we published and we retested and we published from I think 3 different external independent labs. We published the lab reports on our website. As far as I know, they're still there. You can compare the lab results from Danish TV with the lab results from Bureau Veritas and 2 other labs that we published. So we're still, and unfortunately, I mean, we participated to a degree in this program. We were asked the day before they concluded the production of the program to give comments. We did, of course. I mean, the program was cut. You can suspect that, of course, the storyline might have been written a few weeks in advance. What can we say? I mean, we hold fast by that we do not burn. That would not make any sense for us at all. I mean, there are better ways to get rid of clothes that are not sold than burning them. We'd have to pay for burn them. If we really need to get rid of clothes because sales are low or for whatever reason, we miss a season, a late delivery, we miss the fashion window, there are ways for us to get rid of those clothes and still earn a profit. It might be lower than we'd expected or wanted to, but we would never burn clothes and which we would have to pay for. It simply does not make, I mean, we've been in the fashion industry and made a healthy profit since 1947. We would not do this. It makes no sense whatsoever. The other, I think the interesting question is, I mean, how can so much clothes that are clearly not safe to use, either if whatever you trust the Danish TV, you trust our labs, how can so many clothes that are not safe to be used be transported all the way here? So you would have to dispose of them because that is still a problem. The clothes are being burned. I mean, how are the? I mean, here, I mean, we came back to the question of governance that you alluded to in the beginning. I mean, it's how we've since about 25, 30 years built the global fashion supply chains, that we're all outsourcing every step of the production. I think, is an interesting discussion to be had.
Yeah. Okay, thank you so much for those excellent questions. And thank you so much for being so generous and taking the time to come here to answer questions and join the discussions around these really, really huge challenges.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.